This is Richard, and I want to welcome you back to the Innovation Best Practices episodes with listeners in 72 countries and growing. Each one of these episodes is specifically designed to help you sell more and make more from your innovation program, and we're dedicated to bringing the latest and breaking best practices along with many that are proven and practical for many, many years. If you want to listen to the Innovation Best Practices, we have a VideoCast and a podcast. The VideoCast is on YouTube. All you need to do is go to YouTube and in the search bar put Richard Innovation Best Practices. A list of search results will come up, and we're down there, 4th, 5th, 6th, whatever. Scroll down, you'll see it, click on that, and you will come to the specific page that lists all of the VideoCast currently available. You can also listen to this as a podcast, and you can go to i2ge.com. That's the letter I, number 2, ge.com/podcast. Or you can go to iTunes in the podcast section and search for Innovation Best Practices, and you'll find us right away. If you find our podcast helpful when you're on iTunes, we'd greatly appreciate it if you'd give us a 5-star rating and a review. It really, really helps us to get the word out on these episodes. We also have a free app for the iPhone and iPad and for Android devices at Google Play. So a free VideoCast, a free podcast, and free apps. You have no excuse to not become a subscriber and regular listener to Innovation Best Practices. If you want to contact me, it's very easy. Just send me an email to richard@i2ge.com. I love hearing from listeners. Look forward to hearing from you soon. Today's podcast is my interview with Larry Keeley. The 2 previous podcasts have been pulling some of the most powerful and relevant insights from his seminal book, 10 Types of Innovation, which is one of the best innovation books I've ever read. Larry is president and co-founder of the Doblin Group and a director at Deloitte Consulting. He's been, as president and co-founder of the Doblin Group, he's been there more than 30 years. This guy knows innovation. He's also an adjunct professor at the Kellogg School of Management and the Institute of Design, 2 very wonderful places where he can share his expertise. So, without further ado, let's get into my interview with Larry. Well, I'd like to welcome a very, very special guest. As I've told you in the run-up to this podcast, his book on the 10 types of innovations quickly became one of my all-time favorite innovation books, and to be able to have the author of that book on the Innovation Best Practices podcast is a great joy for me. So I'd like to welcome Larry here and ask him to kind of introduce himself and tell us something about the Doblin Group or anything else that he'd care to share with us before we dive into the subject matter.
Well, thanks, Richard. It's a pleasure to talk to somebody who's actually read the book. The heart of our work for 34 years now has been to try to figure out how to get innovation to succeed instead of fail. So we've treated the topic as scientists, and we've brought to it a lot of skepticism. Every time we find what are common practices in innovation, especially because all companies around the world and all geographies tend to get fewer than 5% of their initiatives to return the cost of capital. At some point along the way, Richard, I wised up enough to sort of ask the question, what is it we're doing wrong if our normal failure rate is greater than 95%, right? I mean, that means that innovation, when I started, was roughly where leeches were when they were the most sophisticated medical treatment, right?
Yeah.
So part of what I've been trying to do is just treat the topic as a scientist, figure out what we could prove, be skeptical about everything, and try to build out the tradecraft that allows people to innovate reliably, especially for the boldest, gnarliest, most valuable forms of innovation. How do you do it so it works instead of fails?
Yeah, that's well said. That's well said, and I think many people who tiptoe into the area of innovation get excited about innovating and the possibility and everything, but really don't know all the things that you've experienced over the years about how challenging it is. And you used one word that I really love, and that's the word craft, because innovation genuinely is a high-level craft. You've been kind enough to share with me that there's three topics that you'd like to share with my listeners, and the first one of them is to innovate better, something near and dear to my heart. So, love to hear what you have to say about that.
Sure. So this is the heart of what my colleagues and I have built over a long period of time. In the early days, what we thought, at least what I thought, was that if we just brought more sort of customer empathy and customer insight to innovation teams, that innovation would be easier and smarter and better. It was 29 years ago that one of my first strategies was to bring an awful lot of social scientists. We all now know, Richard, I think, the value of bringing in anthropologists and sociologists, but it was 29 years ago when we at Dublin first started doing that and building systematic ethnomethodology teams. It did make a big improvement, but it only maybe doubled success rates, and that meant we were still failing 90% of the time instead of 95% of the time. So through the years, what we've learned is to tackle a bunch of sort of epic stupidities that everybody assumes are good, but turn out not to be so good. So brainstorming, I believe, Richard, is a carcinogen the Surgeon General should eventually get around to regulating. Um,
I love it.
Voting with sticky dots is pretty much guaranteed to get you a groupthink error of commission and an even worse error of omission, and your failure to select the boldest and least familiar forms of the ideas. Things like stage gate processes, even when they're installed with the best of intentions and to the tune of $2 or $3 million, literally guarantee, Richard, this took me years to establish, literally guarantee that you're going to get total performance mediocrity for your corporation. Um, and they always slow you down by a lot compared to the new norms of how swiftly one should innovate. So those are some of the biggest things. I would say the single biggest thing that people do is they assume when they get into a room and start to think about what they should do that the answer is some new product or some new technology. These days, when you look at all the coolest things in the world, they tend to be much more built from the careful orchestration of many well-known things, including things that are 30 years old or more, into some new experience that the rest of us are super grateful for. That is not as sexy as saying I'm going to take a bunch of eggheads and put them in a remote location and feed them on whatever it's going to be lately that people think enhance creativity. High octane foods and oxygen bars and all that stuff that people sort of celebrate. They believe it takes rocket scientists and geniuses and gadflies and mavericks to innovate. And I think you can teach it to anybody. And I think we can all be better innovators if we start to embrace the stuff that works and reject the stuff that is just, sort of rooted in lore, not in logic.
Yeah, I think a lot of good things said there, and I think it's interesting as I have a podcast called Innovation Best Practices, and I attempt to discover what is maybe a good practice and what's really a best practice. It's there's a lot of, as you said, lore out there,
Mm-hmm.
and you really need to parse it. And the other thing that I really try to do is to stick to proven and practical stuff that really works. And I'd appreciate your thoughts on a bit of process that you find and that works better than not, or works in most situations. I mean, you hear about companies trying to emulate startups by creating little startup units within the company. My former alma mater, Procter and Gamble, has experimented with this more than a couple of times. And you hear everything from crowdsourcing to open innovation and on and on. Are there some processes that you can share with us that kind of take the place of StageGate and other things that tend to be more effective and increase your chances for success?
Sure, Richard. So the reason people have stage gates is because somebody convinces them somewhere along the way that the company has an infinity of possible uses for its scarce capital, so it needs to reduce all possible investments to a shared set of metrics and then bring in rational methodologies to prioritize across those different investments. And I mean, what could be more logical? I mean, I could sell anybody a stage gate in a matter of minutes and explain why it is imperative that we compare everything. What they forget is that that process tends to add at least 9 months to decision making these days. And it also presumes that you can do things best with some kind of central command and control world. And I think if there's anything we've learned in modern business over the last few years, that's sort of the things be challenged. After all, Richard, you and I can step back from it and look with the wide angle lens and see that central control didn't work all that well in the former Soviet Union, didn't work all that well in Cuba. I haven't been to visit personally, but I'm hearing it's not working super well in North Korea either. So why would we think we can get it to work inside of corporations? One of the ways that I attack StageGate is fairly mean, but I go into companies and I say, all right, I don't really want to know about all the StageGate stuff you're doing right now. Go give me the printouts from the ones you did 5 years ago. And let's just do a quick assessment and see how different the world is from what you thought it was going to be when you built that several years ago. And literally always, the gap, the yawning gap between what they thought the world would be like and what they proved was a giant, epic, cavernous, gap. So what do you do instead? One of the most important things is what we call high protocol innovation, Richard. We think of this as the opposite of brainstorming. So Doblin has invented this tradecraft over many years to try to give people the ability to generate ideas that, instead of being numerous, are deep. So I think of it as the sort of goal of producing a smaller number of bigger ideas. And that turns out to be interesting and important. So if brainstorming gets you a large number of little ideas, high protocol innovation gets you a small number of big ideas. And it turns out that the companies that invest in that over time tend to get much more dramatic results. So those things are actually embodied in about $6 million worth of tradecraft that we give away for free in a 10 Types of Innovation app on the iTunes store. So people can, if they're interested, Richard, at least download it and look at it and see if it's useful to them. Where that comes from is our ability to work over many years with corporations all over the world and student teams all over the world to try to get people to create breakthroughs with less friction and with more robustness. There are other pieces of tradecraft too, so let me know if you want a few other examples.
Yeah, I greatly appreciate you sharing that, and I've always looked at company culture to be probably the single biggest inhibitor from a big picture standpoint. And when you talked about command and control structure not being conducive, probably to a lot of things, if anything, I've got a book that I took 9 months off to write, not published, and it's called The Death of Command and Control.
No,
And,
smart.
and it really talks, I mean, you've got the W.L. Gores out there and other folks that are out there, where you move from an organization of authority to an organization of influence, and it's a very powerful change, and a lot of people are discovering this, but it's more of a slow burn than a rapid burn at the moment.
Well, for
So
goodness sakes, man, get your book to a publisher already. I want to read it.
yeah, and actually I have it's a story for another day, but I actually have 6 different tools that you can use to move from a command and control to a more open sort of structure and environment. It's not just saying, boy, wouldn't it be nice if we could be here? It's here are the tools that are proven in other applications and environments that can help you go from there to where you need to go. But
Got it.
so anyway, a lot of fun. The second topic that you talked about, and this podcast could easily go for an hour and a half based on the what we've already talked about, but would like to get your thoughts on you. One of the things you said you wanted to talk about was innovate on different things.
Right.
And again, that's another one that just when I read it, I went, yes, I want to hear about that.
Okay, so the default setting that almost every team has is that they're supposed to create a new product. Your world in P&G is a perfect example of that. You know that P&G through the years was famous for creating product variants, and yet every time it created a new platform or franchise, and the classic example used in the modern era is Swiffer. Other examples could have been Tide or Crest or Bounce. Then you get dramatically greater return on investment from that new franchise than you do from a new flavor of Crest toothpaste, for instance. And so that's a generally important insight, but unfortunately, most innovation methods haven't caught up with that. So at a minimum, when I work with graduate students, and I teach the topic at the world's #1 rated design school, the Institute of Design in Chicago. I also teach it at Kellogg Graduate School of Management and McCormick School of Engineering, both at Northwestern. And what I love to do with students is to get them to be hungry to create at a minimum platform level innovations. Those are things that we all know and love, like the iTunes Store, or the ability to create something that is robust and scalable, like the Zappos interface, or the world of Uber's app or Airbnb's app. That platform level innovation at a minimum, typically in a connected world, Richard, gives people vastly greater lift and leverage. The most valuable thing to think about these days is an ecosystem. So beyond Uber's app is the entire world of attracting drivers, many of them getting a job that they otherwise could not have gotten, and creating something that will make customers really love Uber or its near competitor Lyft. Those things are really cool, and doing it effectively, thinking about what it means to have a bigger aspiration to create something that lives beyond products, is the starting place for getting to a smaller number of bigger ideas.
Yeah, and very well said. And I think your book on the 10 different types of innovation really feeds, in my interpretation, to the platforms and ecosystems approach, and that multiple dimensions of innovation are required to try and create platforms and ecosystems. And associated with that is one thing that I have found very important, and that is in working with companies, is to have a vision of what success looks like in whatever their innovation program. It's Stephen Covey's "Begin with the End in Mind," if you will.
Sure.
And when we work with companies on a vision, one of the key things I often ask them is, what business are you really in?
Mm-hmm.
And, we've got the Stephen Jobs famous example of, we're a computer company, to we're the digital hub of the home business, in that business, and how that transforms a company. But could you talk a little bit about the very beginning of an innovation process
Sure.
creating a vision of what you want to be, and how that ties together?
Yeah, well, this is a lovely piece that connects back to our earlier conversation on tradecraft.
Yes.
So here's a fun fact to know and tell, Richard. More than 90% of the time, the real number is somewhere around 93, 94% of the time, a team that sets out to innovate, through no fault of their own, mind you, with the very best of intentions, will focus on the wrong problem. They will have defined the problem either too tightly or too obviously. And as a result, even if they're just brilliant at all their innovation work, what they're going to come up with is an answer that's more or less the same as all their competitors, or more or less the same moment, right?
Yes.
So there's a structural reason why this occurs. Scientists have had a name for it for 177 years. It's called simultaneity of discovery. And what's interesting about that is that the way you bust out of it is through identifying the orthodoxies in an industry, the hidden assumptions that sort of keep it stuck in a particular pattern, and find a way to stand a little further in the future. One of the best pieces of work that, again, almost no company that I know of spontaneously creates is what we at Doblin call an innovation intent, essentially a measurable mission for innovation. If you have that, and that takes a lot of top management effort to articulate, you're fully 20 times more likely to get a good outcome.
Wow.
Which is a really amazing thing. So an
Yeah.
example of an innovation intent is what came from, John F. Kennedy when he said, I think that we should put a man on the moon and bring him back again
Yep.
before the decade is out, right? That
Yep.
was a mission. What was typical of it, and this is typical of why innovation intents are hard, is you kind of declare your goal. It's objective, it's measurable, it's got a time frame, it's epic, it's inspiring, but you don't know the answer to how you're going to get there. You have to ultimately trust the talent in the firm. And that gets really interesting when you have to sort of treat it that way. So where I'm going with that is that if companies don't have a North Star that they're using to say, over time, we're going to be the best in the world at X or Y or Z, again, even if they're somewhat successful at innovation and routinely getting, good ideas, they will tend not to be recognized as one of the best innovators in the world because they won't necessarily add up to something. So there's several problems that we're talking about right now, Richard. One is work on the right things, and the other is work on those things so that you reframe them from the very beginning with some techniques to identify orthodoxies and get outside of the assumptions of the field, and then work on them using a sort of expectation that over time you're going to get cumulatively better at some very hard and important things that people will ultimately value.
Again, very well said, and it reminds me in Jim Collins' book "Good to Great." He talks about those companies had a hedgehog concept, which was something that they were going to be best in the world at,
Right.
as their guiding vision. And underscoring what you're talking about is that when you have that what you call innovation intent to become best in the world, and you define what that is, and that's not done with a magic wand. It's done with rolling your sleeves up and having some really good and tough conversations. But when you have that, it is that North Star that guides every step that along the process, and it to me it rises to the level of inspiration. It
Yep.
rises to the level in certain cases of being noble purpose, which appeals to the higher essence of who we really are. And it's those kinds of things that also have the ability to bring the very best out of people, not only in the innovation process, but who need to breathe life into that idea day after day, year after year.
Exactly. And let me illustrate so that you and I aren't sharing abstractions with each other.
Yeah.
Dr. John Noseworthy is the current CEO at Mayo Clinic. And, he was put into his role and he thought about what he wanted to challenge the organization to do. And this is the way he said it ultimately. He said, Mayo Clinic took 136 years to learn to serve 20 million patients a year. By the year 2020, I'd like us to serve 200 million patients a year, and I don't want to build any more hospitals. And when he first said that, Richard, people thought, he needed his medication adjusted. And what's so interesting, and it does exactly what you're talking about, ultimately it's inspiring, it's challenging, he's counting on the talent in that extraordinary organization, and he's making sure that everybody understands what the goal is and what the date is they have to hit the goal by. And you get that to happen, and boy, you've got yourself a very, it just forces everybody to think about things very differently. It's another thing about it too. You use the word culture for innovation inside of companies. I never use that word actually, because I've learned that it's confusing to people and it always seems to take so long to get it to change. What I think of is what is the sort of plumbing we can install to make innovation happen. And what you and I are talking about now has a very surprising mechanism. If you work with the senior executives and you get them to sort of say, this is what we care about, this is the kind of company we want to be, this is what we're going to achieve over time. What happens as a result is that when you then later come to them with a really badass idea about something you want to do that's crazy and bold and hard, they're predisposed to say yes instead of no because they can see how it connects to the thing that they declared that they really had to get good at doing.
Yeah.
And it helps the entire enterprise lean forward instead of backwards, to be brave instead of fearful.
Yeah, wonderfully said again. And boy, we could talk a lot more about that, but I really appreciate you sharing that. The third topic that I really want to get to also is you talked about innovating with others, and you said some things, words like a new revolution and lightweight innovation. And these are terms that my listeners have not heard so far, and I'd really love to have them hear them from you.
Okay, well, this is what I teach specifically at Kellogg Graduate School of Management. I do call it lightweight innovation, although, and by that I do not mean that it only handles easy problems. It handles the toughest problems in the world. But interestingly enough, it does it using, and this is a fun little phrase that everybody will understand, crowds, clouds, partners, and prizes to solve those tough problems. And what's so interesting about it, Richard, and the reason why it's so important is because I always talk about the old days of innovation, which were 4 years ago. I've been studying this field now for more than 3 decades, and I've never seen anything like the amazing revolution that we've seen in just the past 4 years. And the past 4 years, what's happened is, the Kickstarter revolution, the Amazon Web Services revolution, Kaggle, groups of more than 700,000 algorithm designers that will read your algorithm challenge, and somebody will self-select into it because he or she has solved that exact class of problem 18 or 19 times and knows how to do it in a fraction of the normal time with code that they're very familiar with. Or you can take an app that in the old days would take you $7 or $8 million in 9 months to develop, and using Top Coder or somebody like that, get the answer and get your first iteration of your app in about 10 days or 2 weeks, and maybe for $10,000 instead of $1.2 million. You can start to do research. In the old days, 4 years ago, minimum of $50,000 in 6 or 8 weeks to get a good answer. Now, if you pose your question properly on something like GigWalk, you can get a robust answer in less than 20 minutes for less than $100, okay? And, you look at really big problems even, like trying to figure out how to get the Ansari X Prize, the spaceship that went out to low Earth orbit twice in a month.
Yep.
Or the Progressive X Prize, which is figuring out how to get a car-like thing to go 500 miles or more on a single gallon of gas. These are just unbelievable challenges. And using prizes to get those things to happen turns out to be genius, Richard. I mean, here's the facts. Every time you create a prize, the world will spend on average 19 times as much as the prize money to try to win the prize. And you don't have to pay any of them unless they actually crack the problem.
Yeah.
So clouds, crowds, partners, and prizes is the easy, fun, headline here. But under the covers, it's a whole new set of tools and tradecraft and ways of thinking and ways of leveraging what a team likes to do. But here's the really big part of this, Richard. These days, if you've got a really bold idea, compared to what was normal 3 or 4 years ago, you can reinvent that business end-to-end 7 times today using the best available methods before you spend as much money as you used to have to spend to get to your first dollar of revenues.
Wow.
Yep, it's unbelievable.
Yeah.
And that's why, even though I've been in the field for 34 years, the revolution that's happening now is like nothing we've ever seen before. And it's why the topic is important, and your podcast is really urgently needed to help people figure out those things that really work.
Well, speaking of urgently needed, if there's one podcast that I is going to be of value to everybody that listens to this podcast, and we've currently got listeners in 72 countries, this is the one. Is there a resource, Larry, that you can point to for this new lightweight innovation, either a book or a website or something like that people could learn more about?
Boy, what a good question. It should be all, sort of codified in an integrated resource. It isn't right yet. It's a fusion field. And unfortunately, the fusion field has dimensions that are partly born in business schools and partly born in social science schools and partly born in engineering schools and some in design schools. So it needs to be put together into something that's cogent and coherent. It isn't yet. I do have a way of turning it into a smart bibliography, and I do that with my students. So I give them sort of 32 books that I think are imperative if they really want to understand the field in detail.
Yeah.
But it's mostly embedded in the tradecraft, the sort of high protocol methods that we at Doblin and sort of get people to use. So I wish I could give people a single book they could go read. Richard, hasn't been written yet. Maybe you'll do it.
Well, I'm sitting at the foot of the master, so I would suggest you do that rather than myself. But I think a good start on this is your slogan, if you will: clouds, crowds, partners, and prizes. And just in those words alone, there's a lot to spark the imagination and what's going on there.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. And for young people today, even the ones that are sitting there with no resources and no job, they should see it as an invitation to be the most productive, the most positive, and the most, sort of gutsy form of revolutionary. I think it's easier than ever before to do something that has big impact if people have the will and have the wit to try and do it in these new ways.
Well, as a note here to all of you who are listening to this podcast, at the beginning of the podcast, I indicated that Larry's book on the 10 types of innovation was one of my top 2 books on innovation that I'd ever read, and it genuinely is. This podcast, which is about innovation best practices, is going to have a new classification for this podcast, and it's going to be Platinum Innovation Best Practices, because genuinely, this has been, for somebody who lives, breathes, and everything innovation like I do, what you've shared with us is absolutely cutting edge, wonderful, wonderful insights that challenges some great preconceptions and practices out there that have been around for a long time as imposters of best practices. And the insights that you've shared with us today, I would just ask my listeners to rewind the podcast and make this one of the podcasts that you listen to over and over again, because you will get new things out of it every single time. So, Larry, this has been a highlight of my month, my week, my year, and I am deeply appreciative of the time you've spent and the great insights that you've shared with my listeners. This has been educational for me in a major way, and I'm a learning junkie, so this is kind of like a high of highs for me, so I greatly appreciate it.
Well, what an honor to be asked, and let's do it again. Whenever you've got another gnarly problem you want to think through, we'll think it through together, okay?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. I mean, one of the things that I do, Carrie McNamara, who I mentioned previously at work with Doug Hall, is I've got a number of case studies conversations that we've done with her that I think help illustrate certain things in a way more than just words describing things do. And maybe I can reach out to you early next year and kind of explore some possibilities along this line. I know you're a busy guy, and I'll be grateful for any minutes I can get and see what goes. But I'd love to have you back. We already got a 3-podcast series on this, but clearly there's room for a lot more here. So I greatly appreciate it.
Okay, Richard, thanks. Count me in. Sounds fun.
Good.
That was a great interview. I hope you got lots and lots out of it. Larry's a truly exceptional innovator and thinker, and it was a great honor to have him in the episode. If you want to know more about innovation best practices, you can go to my website at i2ge.com. On the menu bar, it says DIY Innovation Training, Do-It-Yourself Innovation Training. If you click on that, there's a whole bunch of training programs that we have. If you don't find one there that really fits your needs, just send me an email and we'll design a specific one to meet your unique needs. These are training programs to help you become self-sufficient in innovation so that you don't have to go out and hire expensive consultants like me. I also have published 6 books. One of them is Proven Practical Innovation That Delivers Results. It's available only on Amazon as a paperback and as a Kindle book. I love hearing suggestions, comments, requests, and as always, you can send them to me at richard@i2ge.com. In the next episode, I take innovation best practices in a very different direction. It's called Innovate for Your Life. It's a provocative new direction for how you can use innovation best practices. You can use innovation best practices to solve life's problems and optimize life's opportunities. This is a very, very interesting episode, and one that I'll be doing more on as time goes on. Please make sure that you tune into this. As you know, I am deeply, deeply appreciative of the time you take out of your day to spend with me and listen to the podcast or VideoCast. And I look forward to connecting with you again soon. And until then, please have a great day.